Sounds good. So, yep, I'm Ashley. I run a business called With Jack. We basically help freelancers through difficult situations by supporting you financially and or legally if you have problems with a client. So, think about those big, nasty situations, the extreme ones, threats of legal action, solicitors are involved. So, we help by arranging insurance for freelancers, but we do also assist with more common everyday issues like late payment or non-payment. And then also we're just happy to act as a bit of a sounding board for any problems that you're experiencing, because I think freelancing can be very lonely. This talk, though, we are going to speak about how a contract can save your butt. So we're going to look at some of the common situations that we see it with Jack, and how contracts can help you hopefully avoid these situations from happening or helping you manage them if they do arise. And we'll also touch upon the role that insurance plays in all of this. And hopefully by the end of it, you've discovered a few new clauses to add to your contract or tweaks to make. Or at the very least, you have a bit of a mindset shift and you feel like you can go into your projects a bit more confidently. So that's the goal. Now, I am not going to talk about myself, but I do think it's very important for me to highlight I am not a contract lawyer, okay? I can intro you to one if you want to speak to a contract lawyer, but that is not my job. I've got a little bit of an unusual background. I am an ex-freelancer, so I used to do photography, mostly weddings, a little bit of commercial work too. And then for the past 7 years, I've been helping freelancers through difficult situations with Jack. So I think I've got quite a unique perspective, having been on both sides of the fence. One as a freelancer, dealing with clients, sometimes difficult clients, and then the other side, helping freelancers through difficult situations. So yes, not a contract lawyer, okay? Now, going to kick things off on a slightly negative note. Sorry about this, but I do believe that if you freelance for long enough, you will at some point find yourself working either with a difficult client or on a project that doesn't go smoothly. I think that that's just a given. So, one of the most common situations that we see it with Jack is disputes, conflicts, arguments that arise around the project scope, usually as a result of the client changing the scope midway through the project and not understanding that this will likely have implications on what you're charging them and also the time scale that you can complete the work in. So what might happen is the goalposts of what works to be expected change throughout the project. It's quite normal for the project scope to change. You provide the client with your revised invoice and they freak out because it's very different to what they initially agreed to. Or if they are giving you additional work, but they don't necessarily revise the terms around when they're expecting that work, they can then blame you for the project running late, even though it's not your fault. So the beauty of contracts is that because we know that these are common situations, we can put things in our contracts that enable us to have these conversations with clients prior to the project beginning. We know that this might arise, so we just want to make sure that we both understand what happens in the event that the project scope changes. So it's quite simple, really. Have a clause in your contract that refers to the scope changes and says, if the client alters the brief and requires subsequent changes, the freelancer may require additional payment and the delivery schedule may be amended. And this just makes sure that prior to the project beginning, your client understands that if the project scope does change throughout the project, you will have to potentially revise how much you're charging them and when you can deliver that work by. I think we also have to take into consideration the impact of the scope changing so drastically that it looks very different to the work that you originally agreed to do. So if you think about it, if you've blocked out 4 weeks to work in a project, but then the client shifts the goalposts of what work they want to the point we're now looking at 8 weeks of work, 9 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever, and you've booked another client work, that's obviously going to cause a problem. It has a domino effect, right? Of projects running late. This one runs over, then the next one runs over. So we want to avoid that. So we just need to make sure that we're giving ourselves an easy way out of having to accept those changes. The freelancer may refuse to carry out changes which substantially change the nature of the scope. The other issue that we see with the project scope is actually on the freelancer side of things, and sometimes it's just down to the freelancer not being explicit enough about what's actually involved in the project scope. So what we want to make sure is that the client and the freelancer are on the same page as much as possible. So when writing your project scope, my advice is to be, it's quite simple, but as explicit as possible. Now is not the time to try to look professional or smart by using, I don't know, jargon or, technical terminology if you're a technical freelancer working with a non-technical client. It might sound a bit silly, but when writing your project scope, I would try to do so from the perspective of, if you handed this to a 5-year-old, would they be able to understand what they're going to get from you? We want to remove all ambiguity and make sure that the client can't misinterpret anything. So yeah, with the scope change clause in your contract, all we're doing here is making sure that your client understands that any changes to the scope will potentially impact the cost of the project and also the timescale of the project. The other common issue that we see is clients disappearing throughout the project. So they might ghost you, or maybe they don't ghost you, maybe they just drag their heels with actually giving you the deliverables that you need to do your work. But this is problematic because you might need sign off to move on to the next part of the project. You might need payment to move on to the next part of the project. Or you might not even be able to do any of the work because the client hasn't provided you with the deliverables that you need. And then they pop up weeks or months down the line as if nothing has happened. And they're like, right, okay, cool. So when are we launching? So we really want to encourage clients to keep things on track. And we can do that by including a pause clause in our contract. Now, I cannot take any credit for the pause clause. This was something I came across on the Bureau of Digital's blog. If you Google Bureau of Digital, the pause clause, after this webinar, obviously, then you can read a fantastic blog post on it. But I think it's genius. I've been telling every freelancer I know to include this in their contract because it is a very common problem that clients disappear off the radar, don't give you what you need to move the project forward. So all we're saying here is that if the client's late in providing deliverables like input, content, payment, or approvals, the freelancer will put the project on hold after a period of time has lapsed. Obviously, in your contract, you would have to specify what that period of time is. And I suppose it depends on the type of work you do, the nature of the project. Is it 7 days, 14 days? When the deliverable is received from the client, the project will then resume, but it will be rescheduled based on the freelancer's current workload and availability. I love this. I think it's a genius way of keeping clients on track because it just acts as a bit of an incentive to them, because by them ghosting you or dragging their heels on giving you what you need, it now has real consequences that are going to affect their project, because you will just be moving on to the next project, working with a client that does deliver things on time. And also, if we think about those rare but extreme cases where clients have decided that they don't want to work with you anymore, or maybe they're just canning the project, but they don't necessarily communicate this with you, I think that this pause clause prevents you from wasting time on those types of projects, the dead end projects, because after that period of time has lapsed, you can move on to the next thing. You're not wasting your time here. So yes, check out the pause clause, the Bureau of Digital pause clause. So this one is quite a broad problem, but again, something that we see a lot of, where for whatever reason, your relationship with your client has broken down over time, and quite frankly, you just feel pretty miserable working with them. Perhaps you're dreading a Monday morning now, you feel a bit of anxiety every time you check your inbox, and you're really just looking for an ethical way to terminate the relationship, to end your involvement in the project. Now, one thing that we've seen it with Jack from freelancers who terminate projects prematurely when they haven't had a contract in place, or when they haven't had a termination clause in their contract, is that it can cause all kinds of problems. A common one would be where the client says, well, we're now going to miss our launch date, and we estimate that this is going to cause us loss of revenue, and because this is your fault, we expect you to cover the cost of the loss of revenue. We've seen that happen. Or the client saying, right, okay, we're going to have to hire other freelancers to get things up to speed, and these are additional costs that we didn't budget or consider, and we expect you to cover the cost of that. Honestly, we've seen situations, those situations happen as a result of ending your involvement in a project. So all we want to do is have a termination clause in our contract. It sounds simple, but with Jack, we don't just arrange insurance for freelancers. We actually work very closely on building the platform with freelancers. So I've signed a lot of contracts in my time, and I was having a look through some of them recently. Very few people have this in their contract. At the bare minimum, all we're doing with the termination clause is outlining how much notice we have to give the client for us to end our involvement. That's it, the bare minimum. But you will obviously want to ask yourself, what other problems or complications might arise as a result of me ending my involvement on this project? So things like, who's responsible for onboarding a new freelancer to take over the project? Or what's going to happen with payments? Is the work that you've done going to be handed over to the client in full, or do you retain ownership? These are just some of the things that you might want to consider. But like I say, at the very bare minimum, you will want to outline how much notice you have to give a client to end your involvement in the project. Similarly, we want to think about how we can protect ourselves if the client wants to terminate the project. So one thing a lot of freelancers do is include a kill fee in their contract, so that if the project at any point isn't going to go ahead, at least you're paid a lump sum for the sort of work and effort that you've put into it so far. Or maybe you're a freelancer that works to payment milestones, in which case make sure that it's clear in your contract that any payments that have been made to you are non-refundable, even if the client isn't going to use your work, even if the client's decided that they're culling the whole project. Make sure that the payments that you've received, the client knows that they are non-refundable. As I've touched upon, terminating a project prematurely can put you in a vulnerable position. Now, the scary thing is that nothing can ever entirely protect us from clients being difficult and making these kind of accusations against us. But by having this blueprint of how to handle this situation in our contract, we're looking to minimize the damage that can arise from a situation like that. And again, that's what's so great about contracts. They're giving you and your client a blueprint of how to handle situations should they arise. So here are some things that I want to talk about that I think are quite important. The first one to consider is assuming, I suppose this was a big assumption that I made, but assuming that most of the people listening to this are from the UK, if you're not, then you'll obviously want to apply your own jurisdiction to what I'm about to say. Make sure your contract is governed by UK law for two reasons. One, can you imagine if you're working with an international client and, say there is a conflict between you both, a dispute arises, and you now have to get legal support. That in itself is a very stressful situation, let alone having to understand how the legal system works in a different country, a country which you might not even speak the language in. So if we work with international clients, we want to make sure that when they're signing our contracts, we're clear that the contract is governed by UK law, that any disputes are going to be arbitrated in UK courts. So that's the first reason. The second reason is to do with insurance. Obviously, you'll want to check your professional indemnity policy, but typically professional indemnity policies do exclude US and Canada jurisdiction. So you can extend it to include US and Canada jurisdiction, but it will cost a lot more money. But by default, it excludes that jurisdiction. So if you work with clients in the US and Canada, again, you want to make sure that they're signing your contract that's governed by UK law, so that the insurer can help defend you if any situations do arise. So all the insurer would do in that kind of instance is, if a threat of legal action is made against you, or a client tries to recover compensation or damages from you, the insurer will source and pay for a solicitor to represent you, and they'll be a specialist in the particular area that you're having the problem with. So if it's copyright law, for example, they'll find a copyright lawyer to help defend you. And then any kind of compensation or damages that have to be paid to your client, the insurance covers that too. But it's important to have your contracts governed by UK law, so that we're dealing with everything here in the place where we are based. So I've talked about insurance there, which is a nice segue into the next bit, which is the role that insurance plays in all of this. Now, I am a massive fan of contracts. If anybody's starting out as a freelancer, it's one of the first pieces of advice that I would give to them is make sure that you have a solid contract in place. But really all contracts are good for is laying the foundation of what duties are to be expected of both parties. Insurance is what steps into action when those duties come into question. So there's a big misunderstanding in the freelance sector that if you have a contract, it's enough to protect you. It will go a long way in protecting you, but absolutely nothing stops a client from bringing a claim against you. Or, you might actually at some point accidentally be in breach of your contract. So really we want to have these two things working nicely together. We want to have our contract, which outlines the duties of what's to be expected of both parties. And then we want to have our insurance just in case those duties ever come into question. Another important thing to include in your contract is just how long you're going to keep client files for. We've seen situations where clients come back after years. Let's just say they've accidentally deleted their website and they come back to you and they're like, okay, so, can I have the files again because I've deleted this? We want to at some point put the onus on the client to make sure that they're keeping their files safe, because we aren't always going to have backups for the rest of our lives. We aren't always going to have client assets for the rest of our life. So consider how that might look. Maybe you say something like, we are going to retain the assets for 12 months after the project launch date. Beyond that point, it's your responsibility to make sure that you have backups and copies and keep things safe. The great thing about contracts is that in our experience, 8 times out of 10, they will resolve situations. They will prevent situations from escalating and having to go further. And what I mean by that is I'll give you a concrete example. Just a couple of weeks ago, one of my customers phoned me in a panic because he had been working with a client. Everything was going well. And then the client just decided to pull the plug on the project. And he had done 90% of the work. And fortunately, he worked to payment milestones and he'd actually just received the final payment. So he'd been paid in full. But the client is now saying, look, we're not actually going to use any of the work because, we've pulled the plug with the contract, with the project. Can we please have some of the money back? Clients, right? What? So he's in a panic on the phone. And I said, do you have a contract? And he said, yes. And I said, is there anything in the contract about payments that have been made to you being non-refundable? And he said, yes. And I was like, well, all you need to do in that case is reply to the client, send them the email and say, I'm really sorry to hear that you don't want to continue working on this. I've attached the contract that was signed and agreed on whatever date. As you can see, no refund is due. That's it. And I'm telling you now, in our experience, 8 times out of 10, the client won't do anything further with that, because it's very hard to argue against things that have been agreed to in black and white. So that's why these contracts are so important, so that we can refer clients to them to remind them the terms that they agreed that they would adhere to. And again, if they don't and they want to take things further, that's why we have insurance. Lastly, I just want to say that none of this really matters unless you have the conviction to actually stand by these clauses. I think having been a freelancer myself and having worked with some difficult clients, I do know that when these sorts of situations arise, it's sort of like your natural instinct to want to appease the client and make them happy at the expense of your own boundaries and mental health and finances and all sorts. But this is a terrible signal to send, because if you're saying to a client, you know what, even though that's what we agreed to in the contract, let's just forget about that. You're just telling them that you don't respect or adhere to the terms in the contract, so they don't need to either. And it opens a can of worms. And I also think that this has implications on the way that the clients treat freelancers as well, because if we all collectively have these boundaries and learn to stand our grounds with clients that are difficult, clients that might want to take advantage of us or try to intimidate us and bully us to get us what they want, if we actually stand our ground, then we're sending them a signal that they can't treat us like this. And then hopefully the next time they work with a different freelancer, they remember that and they treat them with more respect. And all of this comes back to the importance of us being a confident freelancer. And I think that by having a contract, by having insurance in place, that helps you go into projects feeling more confident. It gives you the power instead of putting the power in your client's hands. So that's all from me. I want you to engage in conversation with me. You can send an email to hello@withjack.co.uk, or you can just check out our website, and I'm happy to have a chat with you. But yes, that's me.